I'm Steph.
And I'm Jeff. Each week, we review a film that's streaming on Netflix or Amazon Prime.
As writers, we'll deep dive into the hook, plot, characters, and ending to tell you if it's a good story.
Listen at your own risk. This review contains spoilers.
Now sit back
Relax
and enjoy Stream On. Today, we'll be reviewing Ghost World, streaming on Amazon Prime.
Enid and Rebecca have just graduated from high school. While trying to figure out what to do with their lives, they play a prank on Seymour, a lonely middle-aged record collector. This leads to an unlikely friendship between Enid and Seymour. It also leads to Enid learning some lessons about life.
Ghost World was directed by Terry Zwigoff. It was written by Daniel Clowes and Terry Zwigoff, and it's based on the 1993 to 1997 comic book by Daniel Clowes called Ghost World. It stars Thora Birch as Enid, a graduating senior, Scarlett Johansson as Rebecca, Enid's best friend and also a graduating senior, Steve Buscemi as Seymour, a nerdy adult that Eden befriends, and Brad Renfro as Josh, a boy that Enid has a crush on. So, Jeff, you chose this movie. Why did you pick this one?
I had 3 reasons. First, I read the comic back in the 90s and enjoyed it. Although I don't remember a lot about it because I haven't picked up an issue in 25 years. I like the leads, particularly Birch and Johansson, both really good actresses, and I was interested in seeing how they played off each other. And finally, I just heard that it was a good movie. It got a lot of good reviews and sounded like the kind of dark comedy that I enjoy. So there you go. So, Steph, what film did this remind you of?
I chose Napoleon Dynamite. Some of the parallels I found were it's a dark comedy about a socially awkward teen that's navigating life. And that's really what Ghost World is as well. It's one of those stories where not a lot happens in the plot. It's more a character study. And Ghost World has that similar issue. I wasn't a huge fan of Napoleon Dynamite, and I tend to like dark comedy, and same with Ghost World, so that's probably why I chose that film as parallel. What about you, Jeff?
I went with Heathers, another dark comedy focused on the travails of teenage life. In this case, the kind of central theme of Heathers, that idea of having to grow up and leave behind some of the childishness, really comes through with Ghost World as well. And I saw a lot of parallels between Enid's dark side and Christian Slater's character in Heathers. Someone who's rebelling more just to rebel and not with any greater purpose in mind. Of course, Heathers turns everything up to about an 11 compared to this movie. I saw those parallels and I was like, oh, okay, this is a very similar kind of film.
Okay, so let's jump into the hook. Jeff, what did you think about this hook? Did it grab you in the first 15 minutes?
It did. I love the opening crawl. You get a camera panning down the street, and you're looking in the windows of a number of homes, and you see all these people going through a bunch of mundane actions, eating, watching TV, and then you get to Enid's room. It's colorful, right? She is dancing around to a musical number from an Indian movie, scenes of which are also intercut with the rest of the opening. You get a sense that she is this center that an otherwise drab and dreary universe crowds around, or potentially is trying to crowd out. I think that the early scenes with Enid and Rebecca show those two actresses and those two characters to really good effect. You get a good sense of who they are and why they're friends, what they bring to the relationship. We also see how these characters have some cruelty to them. They decide to play a very mean prank on Seymour. They see that he has placed a "I missed you" kind of ad. They call the number, leave a message saying that they are the woman that he was trying to reach out to, arrange for a date, and of course, they're just there with their friend Josh to kind of laugh at him. Josh was interesting too because he immediately calls him out. I believe he uh, says that what they're doing to Seymour is a very effed up thing to do. But for these two characters, they're in such a insulated world of their own that those kind of little cruelties are just amusement. You also get a number of other plot threads set up, including the need for Enid to take a art class so she can fully graduate from high school, her relationship with her father and her father's ex girlfriend who's coming back into the picture. You see that Enid is a talented artist, very good at drawing. There are sufficient story threads to tie the plot together. Now, of course, one of the questions we're going to have to answer as we go forward is the plot actually tied up, and are those story threads worth following? About the only thing that didn't work was the art class subplot. It seemed out of place and is actually a very missed opportunity to develop Zena's character. But other than that, the hook worked well. I was engaged, drawn in, and wanted to see where these characters went. How about you, Steph?
So I didn't love the hook. I mean, it did what it needed to do in the sense of it introduced the three main characters, Enid, Rebecca, and Seymour. But there are multiple things about it that just left me not that interested in the rest of the movie. And it's one of those things. You brought it up when we were reviewing another movie, um, Lady Bird, right? When you're so turned off by a scene at the beginning of the film, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. So it's hard to get engaged as the film progresses. And that's what happened to me with this movie, is that I just could not stand Enid's character. Everything from like the go-go dancing scene. I know you liked it. I thought it was weird. I think it was like the intercutting of the Indian go-go dancing as you're viewing these other people's lives. I thought it was a weird way to do that. I didn't mind the crawl, but flashing back constantly to that go-go video, I found distracting. But I can let that go. It's the director's trying to be artsy up front with the film, and you get that it's going to be sort of this indie, quirky, artsy film as a result of how they did the opening. But I think what really caused issue for me is that it just sets up Enid, our main character we're following through the story, as really an awful human being. She has this too cool to care mentality about life and the people around her in life. You know, she makes fun of people that she perceives as more positive or going somewhere in their lives. And she cruelly messes with Seymour, right? This nerdy guy that is just trying to find love and puts out a personal ad with about a woman that he saw, and they had a moment and they missed connecting, so he's trying to reach out to her, and Enid takes advantage of that for her own pleasure, just to, because she's bored, watch someone suffering sitting there being stood up on a blind date that she orchestrated. It was just so cruel and narcissistic. I'm like, this is just an awful human being. Why do I care about her as a protagonist going through this film? Now, if they were going to have terrible things happen to Enid, and maybe I can get behind that to see like what happens when somebody behaves that way. But as we see in the film progresses, you know, we don't necessarily, it's not as satisfying as I would like it to be. So I couldn't stand her character, so I wasn't that interested in the rest of the film because they didn't give her any redeeming qualities, in my opinion, in the first 15 minutes.
Okay. I actually enjoyed her character. I thought it had enough good and bad things to make her believable and engaging. It's kind of to use a Game of Thrones reference, the Jamie Lannister character. He is introduced as someone who is willing to murder a child in order to protect the illicit affair he is having with his sister. As the series goes on, nuances are added, and he has a traditional redemption arc. So, setting up a character who leans more towards negative characteristics can work. I guess the real question is Enid set up as someone who engages in a cruel act, which she definitely is, but where does that act lead? Does it lead to more cruelty, or does it eventually lead to at least some sort of redemption? Assuming you want to go on a redemption arc, which I think this movie does try. I do understand where you're coming from. She is set up as a fairly trope heavy, self centered movie teen. The girl who's, too cool for others, who's looking at the world through very cynical lenses. I didn't have a problem with that, mostly because I was like, okay, what are they going to do with her? And because I think they did some interesting things with her, I can look back on that setup and say, well, it worked. Obviously, if you look back from the rest of the film and go, blah, she was terrible from beginning to end, then yeah, I could see where that would be unsatisfying or just not a strong introduction for the character. So, is there anything else about the opening that you didn't like or did? Or is that pretty much it?
No, I mean that's pretty much it. I just Enid's character was so ugh. I mean, Scarlett Johansson's character Rebecca was fine, but Enid left such a bad taste in my mouth. I didn't find anything redeemable in her to have her as the protagonist moving along in this film. And you mentioned Jamie Lannister, and he's set up to be more of an antagonist. I know he changes through time in Game of Thrones, but it's one thing if you're setting up a character to be an antagonist. That's fine if they're a terrible human being because that's how you're setting them up. But this film sets up Enid as our primary protagonist we're following, and to be a protagonist, you need some qualities that you end up caring about in this character. And I just didn't. Like, to use another example of a film that worked in that way, setting up a character that had some flaws and some unlikability, was Brittany Runs a Marathon. Like, Brittany, that was an amazing hook. And she had character issues and flaws, but there was enough redemption there that you cared about what happened to her. With Enid, I couldn't find that.
Well, with Brittany Runs a Marathon, there's nothing particularly redeeming about her in the hook. She is set up as a fairly self centered and self destructive person. She becomes redeemed as the story goes on.
Yeah, but there are moments where she's trying to better herself, and there are those moments that you care about her because she is starting to try to better herself within the hook. You don't see Enid trying to do anything to better herself in the hook. And I would say that's the difference.
So, shall we move on to the plot?
So I want to point out two things as a writer that bothered me about this film. So, the first, no surprise here, is Enid's character, our protagonist, was too unlikable, too few redeeming qualities. And I have multiple examples to give about that. So, she's mean to everybody, including her best friend, Rebecca. She has this mentality where she looks down on others, that everyone's too stupid but her. There's this really nice girl, Melora, who is she's a positive personality and she's trying to be inclusive of Enid. And Enid just makes fun of Melora instead of looking at her as someone that's got, a bubbly personality and that she's a positive person. Enid just makes fun of her behind her back. She can't keep her promises, even to her best friend. She and Rebecca made this deal that they would move in together and get an apartment after high school. And so Rebecca is moving forward with that plan, and she's going and looking at apartments and working and saving up money for rent. And when she brings Enid along, Enid is just, she finds flaws with every place they look at, and she's not doing anything to actually like hold down a job and contribute to her end of it. to the point that Rebecca decides, well, I'll just rent this apartment on my own without you. And then Enid begs her not to. She convinces Rebecca that she is good for her half of the deal, but then leaves Rebecca stranded. And random people she attacks too. She has a yard sale where she's selling her clothes to try to earn some money. And there was a girl that goes and asks how much a dress is. And Enid gives an absurd amount, like hundreds of dollars. And the girl reasonably says, that's ridiculous. This is a yard sale. And Enid then just attacks her and tells her how horrible she would look in that dress. Just absolutely mean to a random person for no reason. So I would love to know what you found redeeming about Enid's character, Jeff.
Let's be clear. The movie clearly looks at those moments as being childish. They're not being held up as behavior to emulate. You're not supposed to see those as positive moments. She's literally called out on it on a number of times. So you give the example of the deal she has with Rebecca to move in together. That is clearly a plot thread meant to show how Rebecca is actually maturing and Enid is holding herself back. She doesn't want to give up on childish things, which is, again, one of the entire points of this movie is that you, at some point, have to give up on your childish ideas. Rebecca even mentions, she calls it out. She says, we made this deal in seventh grade. Maybe we should just skip it. The moments that you are bringing up are there to show the flaws in Enid's character. What you're saying is that by the end of it, you don't think that she has redeemed herself on anything when she clearly has. She goes and we can get more into the end, but she does try to make amends with at least some of the characters that she has wronged through the bulk of the film. Now, you can say the redemption arc isn't satisfying, but it's there. You want this character to have, on balance, more positive aspects. So, for example, after she befriends Seymour, all the work that she does to try to get him to go out, to try to get him to hook up with a woman, which he clearly wants to do, escorting him around, going, basically befriending the man and being one of the few people he can connect with. None of that makes up for the random cruelties we also see, in your opinion, right?
Yes, let me explain why it doesn't make up for that, because I don't see her befriending of Seymour as genuinely interested in Seymour's well being. I see it as entertainment for her boredom to watch this guy haplessly go through life. And the reason I say that is because she destroys his relationship. Seymour actually starts dating the woman from the personal ads. Like, she responds to the ad and she's out of his league, but she's a very nice lady. And they start having what seems to be a positive relationship. And Enid gets jealous of that. She violates boundaries multiple times, going over to Seymour's house out of her own boredom, and ends up sleeping with Seymour and basically promising that she will be his girlfriend. He believes her. He breaks up with the healthy woman, and then Enid just ditches him in the end. So all of her involvement with Seymour ends up just putting him in therapy and him losing the best thing that had happened to him, which was dating that professional, beautiful woman. And so I just saw that as really selfish on Enid's part throughout the whole thing. It wasn't a genuine friendship.
I think you're completely wrong about that. She has genuine feelings for him. That's why she becomes jealous of Dana. She doesn't do that on a lark. She is an 18-year-old girl who has a crush on this older guy and doesn't know how to handle it. And how she handles it is poor. I mean, I don't disagree with that. But again, it's supposed to be poorly handled. We're not looking at Enid saying this 18-year-old girl who got jealous of the relationship that she helped set up is a positive thing. We're supposed to see this as a character who has flaws. Seymour is one of the few people that she has a connection to. So when she sees him drifting away from her, and to some degree, cruelly drifting away from her. I mean, there is a scene between the two of them, like near the end of the film, where he tells Enid that he's not going to see her anymore because Dana thinks it's inappropriate. And then after that, Enid eventually gets to the point where she sleeps with Seymour and spins some stuff about how she's going to move in and all that, which actually says more negative things about Seymour's character and some of the writing for that character than it does about Enid, which I'll get into in 1 second, some of the problems with the plot. There are enough indications, however, that there are genuine feelings between Enid and Seymour, or from Enid towards Seymour. Not to get too deep into the end, but we do see a scene where she goes through her book of sketches, which is extremely important for her, and shows Seymour some of the art that she made of him that shows what she really thought, that she sees him as an important person. I mean, the art is like all her stuff is filtered through sort of a kind of an acerbic lens, but it was done with affection. So I don't agree that this relationship was purely one sided and that Enid was pursuing it just to watch Seymour dangle.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just took very different things from this character. I mean, there was too many instances that showed her lean towards narcissistic personality disorder that I just kept seeing that in the scenes. And so just couldn't really care about her. I mean, even she couldn't even do her own artwork for the art show. She had to steal art from for Seymour and actually get him in trouble because of it. She couldn't even do her own legitimate art. Like that's like how terrible of a character she was. Like just not I just didn't have anything to hang on to. So I know we just took just like with Lady Bird, we took really different things from this film. And that's what's so interesting about the viewer, right? When you, as the viewer of the film, what you pull out versus somebody else pulls out, you bring your own experiences to watching a film, and what you see, impacts how you think about the film.
Agree completely. And you do mention the painting. So basically, Seymour works for a fast food company that in the 20s had a very racist name and racist ad logos. And he has like one of the old posters, and Enid borrows it to take into her remedial art class. And she spins some sort of woke PC nonsense that the teacher, played by Ileana Douglas, loves. That was one of the scenes that I think did not work well. But I had a problem with the entire art school plot. To me, it detracted from the more interesting parts of the movie and didn't really do anything. I would much preferred excise that and spend more time with Ian and Rebecca, because one of the other problems with the movie is Rebecca kind of fades as the film goes on. Having these two characters focus more tightly on them as they're developing in different ways would have been much more interesting. The problem that you bring up with that piece of art, for that entire sequence to have had the kind of dramatic effect that the filmmakers clearly wanted it to have, it should have been a piece of her art. It should have been something that came from her that she cared about, then got her in trouble.
Exactly.
I was watching that and I'm like thinking about the writers, particularly since one of the writers was the creator of the comic, and I'm like, are you missing your character here? Do you not understand your own character? Even if it had been just a tracing of the original piece, I think it needed to be something that was directly connected to one of the primary ways that Enid expressed, if only to herself, what she was really feeling.
Right. So the art is, if you were to pick out positive or redeeming character trait about Enid, it would be her artistic ability, because she does use that to interpret the world and she is a talented artist. And so that would have been a great opportunity to explore more depth of her character if it was actually her art. And then she misses the art show and this and that. She misses an opportunity to actually, the teacher works to get her an art scholarship, and she even messes that up. She can't even follow through with like the one thing that would be good for her, which is the art scholarship. So yeah, it's unfortunate.
Well, the art scholarship, though, is pulled not because she's late, it's pulled because of that piece of art.
Right, right. I mean, she wasn't there to explain the art in a way that maybe would have salvaged it for her.
Her losing the art scholarship and therefore another avenue out of her life is closed off would have made a lot more sense if it had been her own work. It may seem like minor plot point, but again, her art is a very important part of her. And for a lot of that third act drama to hinge on something that she got from Seymour just isn't very satisfying. There were a few other moments with the character that seemed odd. Not necessarily any of the things you brought up as negative traits, because I think they actually worked to like create some depth to this character. But there is a scene where she does get a job at a movie theater and she is behaving in a inappropriate way with the patrons. And it didn't make much sense because she is set up as an intelligent person. She should know that you don't, mock the people coming up to buy stuff at a movie theater. And it's not set up that she did this to get herself fired. It's like she literally didn't realize this isn't how you interact with people. For a character who is set up as intelligent and consciously cynical towards others, it seemed like she had just a hard time understanding normal social cues.
If you go with my theory that they wrote her to be a narcissist, that falls in line with someone that is narcissistic, is they have so little empathy for the world around them. They're so self-involved, thinking that what they think is the most important, that they will misread social cues, or they'll say very mean things and not care what they're saying because they're that narcissistic. And so I think it depends on what you look at in terms of the underlying personality. You look at her as purposefully biting. I look at her as just narcissistic. So that scene worked for me in line with her character.
Well, that brings up a potentially interesting point, or at least an interesting read of this movie. Is this supposed to be a redemption arc for a flawed character, which is sort of how it presents itself, and which sounds like is one of the core problems you have with the film? Or is this an attempt to get inside the head of a toxic narcissist? That the read of the movie is Enid has such a severely distorted or toxic way of looking at the world that it's ruining every relationship she has in the world around her, even while she thinks, at least for part of the film, that this is a satisfying way for her to exist. So there isn't a redemption in this. Does the film work better if you look at it in that light?
So it does. If you look at it in that second light, that you're exploring how a toxic person navigates life and the challenges there of what happens to relationships where they burn bridges, then that to me is more interesting. But I think the writing is flawed because you don't see the full impact of that in a negative enough way on Eden's character. You see their attempts at a redemption arc, and it wasn't very redeeming, in my opinion. Like, there wasn't enough of a redemption arc to go that direction, nor did they go enough in the other direction of she's a toxic character and something terrible is going to happen to her because she's toxic. They try to sort of go both ways. And because they didn't pick a direction strong enough, it was hard for me, especially because they set her up to be a protagonist, not an antagonist. It's fine if your antagonist is a narcissist, not your protagonist, if we're supposed to care about what happens to her.
I think that you have a very restricted view of a protagonist. It seems like you're saying the protagonist has to have positive characteristics. The protagonist is just the person who's at the narrative center of the story. They can be positive or negative. I mean, you can look at something like American Psycho, where the protagonist is a narcissistic serial killer. Protagonist doesn't necessarily mean good person. Protagonist is mostly this is the center of the narrative, and your antagonists or antagonists are the people who, or forces or whatever, they're trying to hold that protagonist back or prevent their journey through the narrative.
So American Psycho, let's bring that up. I didn't mind that protagonist. Yeah, he's an evil, narcissistic, awful human being, but he was interesting to watch and you knew he was that and you got to see him unravel, right? So that's interesting to me. You with Enid though, they set her up to be very unlikable, but you don't see her redeem herself or go downhill. You don't see either happening in this film. You just see her staying stagnant. And I think that's, for me, there wasn't enough growth in either direction. If that's if it's a downward spiral growth, like an American Psycho type thing, fine, that's interesting. If it's an upward spiral, like Redemption Arc, fine too, that's interesting. But there needs to be enough growth for me to care about the character. And because she was so unlikable with not enough growth, positive or negative, I had a hard time really like sinking my teeth into this character. There was no like that gets into the lackluster plot thing. There wasn't enough plot for me where the character's going up or down to stay interested in this film. Am I explaining that well enough?
I understand your point that in certain stories, character growth and development is key. I think there is character growth in this. In fact, there's more character growth in this than there is in American Psycho. American Psycho, in fact, actually ends with Patrick Bateman saying that nothing was learned, nothing was gained, basically, that everything remained as it was when it began for him. Enid does suffer consequences for her actions. She loses out on an art scholarship. She has some significant problems with her friendship with Rebecca, although it seems by the end that there is some sort of reconciliation going on. Clearly, her relationship with Seymour is over, even if he doesn't really blame her for what happened.
So, Jeff, yeah, what did you think about how this film ended? I mean, I know we've had really different experiences with this film.
I believe that mostly works. Enid hits rock bottom and then tries to make amends as best a fantasy prone, sort of introverted 18-year-old can. I do think that there was at least the hope for growth at the end, if that's what you're looking for. And again, I believe that this was set up to be a redemption story. There were some problems with it. The big one, I think, was actually with Seymour's character. His reaction to Enid saying, why don't I move in with you and be your girlfriend and all that kind of stuff? And he takes it as accurate, as truthful as a thing to actually hang his future on is very strange. It's kind of makes him seem more infantile than he was in the rest of the movie. But for the most part, the ending really works. Now, there is something I want to talk to you about, and that's the bus at the end. I'd like to have that as our final discussion. So, what worked about the ending or didn't work about the ending for you?
So I wrote in my notes, this will not be a shock given how I felt about the rest of the film. I wrote in my notes, nothing worked about this ending for me. Basically, if I had to sum up this film, we endure Enid being a terrible human being throughout the film with not a lot of growth, and she's kind of aimlessly drifting through life, being a horrible human being, and yeah, burn some bridges along the way. And in the end, she gets on a bus and leaves town. Very anticlimactic. Like, I wanted more to happen. The consequences of her actions, I wanted to be greater, or I wanted her to have more of a light bulb moment about how awful she's been and where this has led her and do more to redeem herself. That one scene with her in the hospital with Seymour where she's showing him her drawings wasn't enough for me. There was really nothing there that was healing between Enid and Rebecca. I agree with you that Rebecca was not given enough screen time. I found her to be the more interesting character. At least she's trying to do something with her life after college, and they didn't focus enough on her. Yeah, Seymour's ending set him up to be, he's just a sad human being that made a poor choice to get so invested with Enid and suffered the consequences of that. So yeah, I just didn't like the film, didn't like the ending. It was disappointing.
I just wanted to briefly correct one thing you said about Rebecca after she graduated from college. These characters are graduating from high school. The one thing I did want to talk about, though, is that bus ending. What did you think that meant? Or do you think it meant anything? Because we're given some hints that in a otherwise fairly reality-based story, that's a little bit of the, I don't say magical, but like fantasy getting into the story. We have this bus stop that is out of service, and there's this older gentleman who's been sitting there. Every time Rebecca and Enid walk past it, he's sitting there. And at one point, she sits next to him and is talking to him and says, "You're one of the only constant things in my world." And he says, "Well, something to the effect, I'm going to be going soon." And then we see him get on a bus that has no destination on it and has no passengers on it. And then the film, as you point out, ends with Enid dressed up, waiting at that bus stop, getting on it, and again, no apparent destination and no passengers. So I think there are a number of ways to read that. You can read that into that it is a sign of her growing up, that kind of flamboyant part of her leaving town, that what we're going to see is more of the Enid who is going to try to make amends with Rebecca and make up for what happened with Seymour. One interpretation I've seen, which I don't really agree with, but I understand the reason why there's some speculation about this, is that it's a metaphor for her committing suicide, that the bus is death.
Yeah, I feel like that's reading too much into it because they don't set that fantasy metaphorical tone throughout the rest of the film. I saw it personally. I saw the ending as relocation therapy for Enid. She had burned her bridges in town and she felt she was too cool for the town. So getting on that bus and going somewhere else was her version of relocation therapy to try to reinvent herself and wherever she was headed. I feel like that other explanation is reading a lot into a story that they didn't set her up to be suicidal and there was no other fantastical elements throughout the story.
The writers did an interview a few years ago, probably about 10 years ago, about the film, and that was brought up. And they basically said that that was a plausible interpretation of what happened, but not necessarily the one that they intended. They could understand why people would see that. Like I said, I don't see that. I do think that we're not supposed to take it purely as her literally getting onto a bus. Again, it's been set up that there is no bus line there, and there are oddities about the bus itself. So I think reading into it as some sort of metaphor makes sense. And I understand your interpretation that it's more of her moving on physically to something else. I'm reading a bit more along the lines of it is her negative impulses, her divorcing herself from that and hopefully becoming a better person. The problem with an ending like that is just this, though, is that it's so vague and kind of out of tonal step with the rest of the movie that you can pretty much read anything you want into it.
Right. And even if it's, I can see it be metaphorical and that in her mind she's getting on the bus because she talks about her fantasy of just disappearing one day and leaving town and never coming back. So it could be metaphorical versus she actually got on this bus. But it was a lazy ending to this type of story. And also, if you're interpreting it as growth, narcissists tend to not grow very much in terms of their personality. As a clinical social worker who has spent years understanding the psychology of the mind, and narcissistic personality disorder is one of the things that I've spent some time really studying and working with. Narcissists don't change much, so the likelihood, if because of how they set her up, it's unlikely she's going to really have that type of growth.
Yeah, but let's be clear about something. You're reading a lot into this so that it fits within your own professional worldview.
Yeah, her behavior patterns suggest narcissism because of all the different, scenes where she's acting like that.
I don't think the writers had that in mind. The writers, I've seen nothing where they said we were trying to create a story of someone with narcissistic personality disorder. They're trying to create a story about a standoffish, sort of fantasy prone teen who's trying to make the transition from teenager to adult and doing it poorly. And they have Rebecca as a juxtaposition character, as someone who is doing it and would be generally seen in a more constructive fashion. Your interpretation is your interpretation. So the great thing about watching movies or consuming fiction is you get to put your own spin on it. I just don't think that this is about someone who has some sort of personality disorder.
It's a covert narcissist versus an overt, and it's the same underlying pathology, but how they portray themselves is different. And so very much Enid is portrayed as a covert narcissist. Whether the writers or filmmaker intended it, there's enough there to suggest that for anyone that has studied that pathology.
So what you're saying is that if you're a clinical social worker or a psychologist, this film is probably not for you.
Well, unless you're interested in seeing that as a character and seeing what happens to someone like that, it just I wish it was more satisfying growth one way or another. I'd rather see more of a downward spiral with Enid's character than what they did in this, to be honest. I would have written more negative consequences into her character.
I'm not certain how much more negative things could have gotten for her. She is at rock bottom at the end. It's pretty clear that her only friendships are, at best, tenuous at this point because of what she's done. She is probably going to get booted out of her house because she can't stand her dad's girlfriend who's about to move in. The only thing that was potential out, this kind of random art school scholarship, is gone. All of her primary and secondary relationships are, like I said, either ended or in serious trouble by the end of the movie. And I think she realized that she has been doing a lot of things wrong. That's the whole point of her going to the art teacher with saying, I filled everything out for the scholarship. She's realizing that she has made a lot of mistakes and hurt a lot of people, and she needs to start trying to fix that. Where I agree with you, though, is that it is not as dramatically satisfying as like a big exposition moment might be. It ends on a fairly low key note.
Right.
Would you agree? I guess my last question to you about this before we move on, though, do you really think that there is no growth in the character? And if so, do you think it's because of your assessment that has a personality disorder?
I'm not sure the writers intended to write a covert narcissist, but that's how she came across on film. And so, because of that, there's a mismatch in what happens to this character that I struggle with. Like, if you're going to write someone that's a covert narcissist, show really how bad it can get and all the bridges burn. Like, don't have Seymour give her an out at the end. Like, have it go further down. And if you're not going to write a covert narcissist, show a better redemption story.
So, Steph, what was your favorite scene?
So I felt the best scenes in this film were the art scenes where she was in art class. You have this quirky feminist art teacher, and there's some funny moments there where you've got a student that's obviously the teacher's pet playing on like what the art teacher is looking for. And she talks about this one artwork that she did with the teacup and a tampon, and how it's a feminist reflection of blah blah blah. And it was just, it's funny satire, and it's played so well by the quirky art teacher. I get that it's tonally different than the rest of the film, but it was the funniest parts of the film, and actually where I thought the dark comedy worked best. So that's why I picked those art teacher scenes. What about you, Jeff?
I'm actually going to have two scenes. The first one was just an opening crawl, which I really liked for the reasons I already talked about. The other scene that I thought worked really well is near the end of the movie, and it's where Enid and Rebecca are shopping for like glasses and stuff, dishware for their apartment. It is a nice way to show through their dialogue and actions how the two characters are growing apart, and that Enid is pretty much still standing still and still wants to be that kind of childish character, the childish person. And Rebecca is already saying, well, oh, that's wonderful, but I need, plates for my new house. So how about your least liked scene?
So I'm going to pick that bus scene at the end. It was just too anticlimactic and made me really frustrated that I spent so long watching this movie to get to that ending. What about you?
I was torn between two things. I'd originally thought about the art teacher thing, but those sequences are actually amusing. I just think that storyline could have been taken out and better used to develop Ina and Rebecca more. For the specific scene, I would say the movie theater scene, it makes Enid seem not cynical or standoffish, but kind of stupid. And I just think that just seemed way too out of character for what they had set up. So, yeah, I did not like that. So, what is your final panda rating?
So I did not rate this film very high. That's not shocking given my critiques thus far. So I gave it 1.5 pandas. There's good acting in the film, so it got a point for that. Thora Birch, Scarlett Johansson, and Steve Buscemi did a good job with their characters. I did like whoever did Enid's funky retro outfits, like the costume design was good, so I gave it some points for that. And then the good satire from the art teacher. Otherwise, though, I would skip this movie. You're gonna watch it and then get to this lackluster ending without a lot of character growth and development, unless you want to watch it as an interesting character study of covert narcissism. So one reviewer, what I was found was so interesting is that a lot of people liked this movie, right? It was rated high. It's kind of like the Lady Bird thing, where I really liked Lady Bird. It's another critically acclaimed film with high stars normally, and you did not. And so it's the opposite with Ghost World, right? And so I was just looking to see what other people that didn't like this movie said about it. I found one reviewer who's a super reviewer on Rotten Tomatoes, Jason V. And I want to read what he says because it kind of sums up how I feel about this movie. So Jason says, Ghost World is one of those movies that most likely wouldn't be made today, a story that rides in on the last fumes of the disaffected youth syndrome of the 1990s. There's little joy on the screen. In its place, a group of characters we're expected to identify with for no good reason. Maybe 11 years ago, Ghost World rang true. In 2012, it's a relic of how things used to be. Self-consciously indie may be the best way to describe the film. And he gave it, I think, like 1 star. So, yeah, that pretty much sums up how I feel about this film. What about you, Jeff?
So I gave it 3.5 disaffected teen pandas. Clearly, I like this movie a lot more. I thought the characters were interesting. I enjoyed all the acting. There were, of course, some problems as we went through, but I found this to be a well worth my time. And since I saw that you had pulled out a quote, I too went in search of a quote. Mine is from Roger Ebert, who reviewed this film when it was released. And this, for the most part, sums up what I think is good about this movie and why it's worth watching. It takes such a risky journey and never steps wrong. It creates specific, original, believable, lovable characters and meanders with them through their inconsolable days, never losing its sense of humor. The movie sidesteps a happy ending Hollywood executives think lobotomized audiences need as an all clear to leave the theater. Ghost World is smart enough to know that Enid and Seymour can't solve their lives in a week or two, but their meeting has blasted them out of lethargy and now movement is possible. And there you go. So, go forth, watch movies, and stream on. Check out episodes 5, Brittany Runs a Marathon, and 10, Ladybird, for more about those movies. Thank you for joining us for Stream On. Tune in next week when we'll be reviewing Starship Troopers, currently on Tubi. Stream On is a production of Steph and Jeff Writes Media. Reproduction of this podcast without written consent is prohibited. All rights reserved. 2020.